So firstly, can you hear me? And can you see that? Excellent. Everything's going to work. Well, firstly, I feel like a bit of an interloper here in that we're some distance outside of the national park, which apparently isn't a problem. So thank you for having us. And secondly, thank you also for a slightly longer running slot. We did a day school on the same topic, our ongoing conservation programme on the Abbey about a year ago. Monmouthshire antiquarians, Cambrians, slightly of antiquaries, and that took us pretty much through the same that we're trying to cram into an hour here in a day. So I'm going to try and be very concise. So in terms of what we're going to focus on, talk about, it's an archaeological day school. So the archaeologist is the obvious person to mop up half of that time. I will talk about the anatomy of a very big project, a major project, so within on Cadw guardianship, effectively. Other things that were spoken about a year back, so the great David Robinson, sort of an architectural historian, expert in all things monastic. He did about half the morning, and that was this sort of great introduction to the Cistercian movement, historiography of the Abbey, and so on. We just cannot do that today. So questions, I will loiter around at the end of this. We will probably run into our question time. That's guys, I'll talk about anything at plank for about an hour if you give me a chance. But we'll be about to sort of answer any questions. There are lots and lots of topics you'd easily go off piste on. Lots of rabbit holes to follow down. 45 minutes on every other slide, effectively. So try and stick to the story, keep it linear, and emerge at the other end having excavated the site and started the conservation works we've got another 8 or 9 years of yet. A bit of luck. So there it is. My work at Cadw as an inspector, I'm a regulatory officer, so I deal with everything from Paleolithic cave earth through to World War II bunkers, absolutely anything in between, and the good, the bad, and the ugly, damage cases, planning consultations, all consents in the area that I cover, which is the Welsh border, running across South Wales to the Nedd, the east bank of the Nedd, through to positive things like grant projects. We work up with private owners to try and conserve things for the first time, and the day-to-day advice, the curtain twitching neighbours, through to quite profound little inquiries and people doing a piece of sixth form homework, for example. Anything that affects a scheduled monument of any type seems to lands on your desk for the area as the inspector, aided by a couple of field monument wardens. By far the biggest privilege of working for Cadw, and the most fun thing arguably though, is the access it gets you to the national collection, as it were, the guardianship monuments. One of, I think it's 131 now, made a few recent acquisitions directly in Cadw's care, of which 20 odd have shops, which are things that you'll see on our website. We film Doctor Who at and so on. But the big thing that we really joined Cadw is not to focus on selling trinkets to fund the rest of the organisation. What we focus on is the conservation, stopping things from falling down. So looking at new ways of preserving and enhancing monuments for sort of future visitors to be able to enjoy them. And there's Tintern mid-project, about 9-10 months ago. This great scaffold almost completed. So, where am I? Other one? Yeah. Gotcha. Very, very briefly, won't insult everybody explaining what Cistercian monastery, Cistercian Abbey was. It's a second Cistercian house in Britain, the British Isles. So Waverley in Surrey, founded in 1129, Tintern 2 years later, 1131. And in the same way that the Normans in the conquest, Anglo-Norman conquest of Wales, almost have this pyramid scheme of conquest and invasion, sort of dealt out by the conqueror down to his regional earls, their knights, and their followers, with people taking smaller and smaller parcels of land. The monks colonise Europe in pretty much the same way. You have mother houses in France, sort of founding house at Citeaux, and Le Mans here, that's on the edge of Normandy. We have the mother house for Tintern, so monks sent overseas, and a house founded on the banks of this. It's awful, isn't it? You've got the shaky hands I have at the moment. I'm going to use my stick if you don't mind. There, that's better. The better point, you can see that as well, can't you? On the banks of the Wye, Walter de Clare, the great marcher lords, so it's insurance in heaven for dreadful deeds on the earth, building their castles, controlling territory, and setting up religious institutions and sort of economic ones in boroughs and churches alongside them. So Tintern, there's something on site in the 1130s. And then, I'll say this is no attempt to usurp David Robinson's great talk he gave last time. Quickly run through. Most of the monastic orders based around the order of St. Benedict, a particularly strict way of life, not quite Trappist, but certainly very austere lifestyle, based on one of the main principles being removal from sort of broader society in very remote locations. Tintern now, on the banks of the Wye, sort of trappings of the village, like the village, bit of tourism, but was a very, very remote spot in the 12th century. No roads, no land routes to the site, and winding lanes. The river was the highway of the age that would have taken people in and out. And as most of these houses, they all work pretty much the same, a bit like the Romans. You can predict the plan. Tintern's flipped around from your average Cistercian plans at the conventional buildings to the north rather than the south. So the great church, that's purely a topographic decision. And then around it, you have this great walled precinct with a gatehouse, possibly another one here, Watergate, and various sort of secondary courtyards, sets of buildings for guests, various agricultural, industrial functions that all these great abbeys enjoyed all on one site. But at the moment, you have a scheduled monument here, which is pretty much the inner precinct, inner court, outer court. So only a fragment of the abbey still recognisable as such. And we'll be focusing on sort of crowning glory, the great Gothic church. So, very, very quickly, plan of the conventional buildings, church at the bottom, cloister, lots of different phases of construction. First stone buildings are certainly there by the end of the 12th century, probably funded by the Clare family of Chepstow. And the significant part for us is the church here at the base. It's part of a great Gothic rebuilding of a much more modest, see in the purple, Romanesque or Norman church for sometime before 1200, which was replaced by a building of 1269, consecrated in 1301, and finished off probably with funding from Roger Biggert, its lordly patron at Chepstow. And the final bits were finished here. So we had a sequence which we'll look at in a minute. Where are we? There we go. So the church. So this is the focus of our project and our talk. You can forget the rest of the precinct for now. We'll be back in about 15 years when we've worked on this building to deal with the others, if I've got any energy left. So in a nutshell, we have an early church, much more modest setup, simple unoiled building. Transepts are shown. Their supposed positions marked out in the floor of the current nave, although Rhys will have plenty to tell you about that later on. A modest cloister at the north, superseded by 400 years of monasticism and later buildings, sort of accommodations improved and expanded throughout that period. Where are we? Complete the sequence. Go from the Gothic church, the Romanesque church being left standing, and then gradually replaced bit by bit by giant Gothic mass in 1260s. And then eventually, I think it's 1277, I think it is, effectively, this church came down. East End was complete enough to be consecrated, services to take place in, and then work continued on the rest of the building to the west as this church was gradually demolished. So that's the big picture archaeology of the church at Tintern. From there on, we have a very familiar tale, so common to so many monastic establishments in the country. Development over several centuries, with various communities that lived there, the buildings, the places they lived, their rubbish tips, their burials, and then the dissolution. Again, you could talk for hours on exactly what the dissolution did to Tintern. It's certainly better preserved than most of its contemporary buildings. We've got some theories on that have come out of the excavations, possibly deliberately, carefully dismantled rather than left to fall over, or deliberately flattened anyway, which is why you've got such incredible survival compared to virtually any other church in the country. And part of the reason for that is, wouldn't call him a conservator, but Charles Somerset, 4th Duke of Beaufort, is also a hero at Raglan Castle as well. So the sort of period of growing clamour for the first sort of wave of interest in the ancient monuments, early antiquarians. Sort of Genesis, the Wye Valley Tour, for example, is probably one of the main drivers here. Decided to stop the ongoing piecemeal decay on the Abbey site and to its buildings. So various early antiquarians mentioned things. Actually, Cox, for example, say, miserable hovels built all over the Abbey ruins. I think the Buck brothers have stripped a bit away here. These are plastered with cottages. The church is used as a fives court, possibly some barn space, an entire shanty town of small ruins, sort of built up and around and into various structures. The outer courts were probably the first to be robbed because they were easier to take the stone from. And Somerset put a stop to that. Whether it's entirely altruistic movements, we're not sure, but he certainly had the site cleared. Quite detailed documentation of large numbers of workmen, hundreds of workmen clearing out the floor of the church. Fortunately, it seems they threw quite a lot of the It's the stone they found, the mouldings, bits of graves into the river as well. They collected the good bits. A lot of it seems to have disappeared, but he certainly leveled out the interior and gives us the flat, almost like the uniform sort of surface that we know today inside the Abbey. And we have a glut from sort of late 18th century onwards of records of things that came out of the Abbey. So it's sketchy records of things that wouldn't we call archaeology these days, through objects. This is possibly one of the marshals, great men buried in the great building. Would have been moved from the first church into the second, just leaning up against a pillar. So after it had been exposed by the Duke of Beaufort's people. So while they didn't do archaeology, they didn't really conserve it, I suspect there may be bits of pointing and little bits of propping that we were unaware of, swept away by a century and a half of later intervention. This man was responsible for saving the Abbey from complete ruin and complete robbery. And you can see a similar effect at Raglan Castle, where again they just put a halt to it, stop taking the stone, and then installed a custodian, and it became one of the first ancient monuments you could visit as a proper visitor attraction. I've never done it again. Did this just sort itself out last time? It did, didn't it? Yes, it did. Right. So, end of the 18th century, we'll start the 18th century. Napoleonic Wars and various overseas strife prevented people from traveling abroad, sort of grand tourists, the paintings and watercolors touring the European capitals. It's a period at the start of the 19th century where people actually look closer to home, a bit like staycation, I suppose, from the recent pandemic. People weren't traveling as far and wide. And the Wye Valley, on the back of William Gilpin's book, Reverend Gilpin's book, became a sort of hotspot of tourism. It was actually one of the first earliest hotel sites in South East Wales, specifically for that purpose, rather than the coaching inn, on a sort of site opposite the Abbey. And people came in droves to paint the Wye Valley, often starting at Ross or Monmouth or Chepstow, and floating on like steamboats, paddle boats up and down the river. And we have to glut a massive amount of information. Just appears from nowhere. People drawing the Abbey from every conceivable angle. All the big names like the Turners, Wordsworth, famously talks about in a poem. We've got lots of famous use in Devil's Pulpit looking down. And then you get the forensic stuff from people who are interested in architectural history that are very, very useful to us today as conservators. But you have this image of the romantic ruin that people were out seeking. So whether Goodrich Castle at one end, Chepstow at the other, and Tintern was effectively the jewel in the crown. So you can see these levelled off lawns, which certainly would have been piles of rubble before the Duke of Beaufort started. And then this sort of very Gothic scene of incredible towering tracery. Most of this thing's gone. Ivy just draped dramatically down its walls. Managed to not push the button, then you'll notice. And it's a slightly later from the end of the century, and you can see how the estate were managing the site. The reports, the records of quite a few custodians. We've got a Canadian colleague recently sent some very interesting research on how all that worked. May even have found a whistle. I think in the excavations, telling people get off the grass, that sort of thing. You can see this incredible verdant lawn laying out, which a lot of tourists remark upon. Oh yes, beautiful grassy walks. And here we've got the base of a great screen pulpit, originally crossed the nave, which they did sweep away at some point at the end of the 19th century. It's not directly documented, but presumably to allow watercolorists to see down the full length of the church. But it's a tourist hotspot. Whether you would have had people in sort of quasi-national dress roaming around in the Abbey at this period, I don't know. But certainly, if it portrays an ideal image of the sort of ruined Gothic, anyway, you can see here some attempts at stabilizing bits of the fabric. We'll be working on this window later, and that is pretty much twice the height of this room. It's an enormous piece of stonework. And this is eventually all swept away. So these collections of tracery, bits of monuments. We don't know where a lot of it ended up before the 20th century started. Gone. And then it became a bit too much. I think quite a few deciding factors. A lot of the big estates were on their uppers by the turn of the 20th century. You start cutting your costs. So, Morgan of Tredegar selling off land. Various buildings were coming into state care for the first time. And Tintern became one of the first Welsh monuments, if not the first. Monmouth might just be about there with it, to come into state guardianship, handed over to be preserved by the state. Cadw's predecessors. Of course, we didn't exist, neither did the Ministry of Works. And the first question was, well, who deals with it? And they want us to look after this Abbey, turn it into a tourist attraction for the public. who's got the expertise? Now, we had things like the rules of the Society of Protection of Ancient Buildings, SPAB. They put together conservation principles on how to conserve something without restoring it, like the big stores like Salvin and Wyatt did, like wrecking it, Victorian style. But there were no bodies actually set to do this systematically. So after a bit of head scratching, 1901 came into care of His Majesty's Office of Woods and Forests. I think it's a case of, well, do you want it? No. Okay. But they obviously didn't turn up to the meeting when they were doling it out, so somebody to look after. For 1901, again, it's probably a day of talks about what happened to the Abbey in the early years of the 20th century. Look up David Robinson's works on this in Monmouthshire Antiquary and Archcam and the like. Very, very sort of absolutely compelling commentary on exactly what happened to the building at the time. But say it's one of the first properly systematically conserved buildings to a set of principles in the British Isles, rather than restored on no principles and no evidence whatsoever. And that's what they did. They found themselves an architect, Waller, of Gloucester's cathedral architect. So somebody obviously knew about these old buildings, was used to dealing with them. I think initially a demolition contractor from Penarth set about the east end of the church and started stripping off the ivy, pointing up the wall heads, did some quite big interventions early on, digging trenches into the top of the walls. So the crossing, where the tower should be in the middle of the building, 1.5 meter deep trenches with massive concrete ring beam, just imposing that just to keep the structure stable. And looking at mortars that are probably more like the things we're using today, rather than the sand and cement that we use so much of the 20th century. They were using vernacular methods, but with very hard cements on the wall heads just to stop that moisture and stop the plants taking root. And this is a picture of an early scaffold. We've got lots of these. It's absolutely terrifying. Normally there's somebody smoking in one corner of them as well, or everybody's smoking as a general rule, but they're very, just note how flimsy they are. This looks like a set of pallets stacked on top of some very slender upright poles. That's 35 meters off the ground at the top there. And I think it's further along this, you can see bits of ladders, and there's a ladder there. So it's quite precarious stuff. And the point I'm making, it's quite lightweight in comparison to anything we do today. From then on, His Majesty's Office of Works were created. So this is the first archaeological inspectorate. So my great-great-great-great-grandparents in terms of jobs. And they took the work off the Woods and Forests team, and then carried on doing pretty much the same thing. I think it was just Piers, the first chief inspector, really wanted to get his hands on Tintern, and back in house. If I get a castle project or a big church project, you just elbowing people out of the way. You want to work on these things, so it's exciting, really, really challenging. So they took it on, followed by morphed into ministry works in the war period. Then they became subsumed into the Welsh office. And eventually Cadw from 1981, is it reformed before? I don't know, can never remember. And the thread running through this, it doesn't matter if I work there, does it really? I don't even know where we start. It's like watching the TV, you can press the button, you don't know how it works. But the point I'd make is you've had even though it's a different cast of characters and a different legal basis and relationship to government for all of these bodies, the same threads of professions have run through this. So the professionals, the architects' offices, the drawing offices, the regulatory officer, in my case, the inspector, making the decisions on exactly what we do. People bring these things to you and say, okay, that looks like the most acceptable fit. And then you have the craftsmen. We still have our in-house masons that carry out the work as well. So the name changes, but the procedures and the processes remain pretty much the same. Some of this work is pretty audacious. This is a ministry work in the 1920s. So you look at a picture of the aisle, south aisle of the nave, which is effectively splitting away from the walls on the other side. So two big interventions there. The first one, they built this thing, and it looks like a railway bridge. You see other photographs of it. So this point here is the center point of a pillar. They dismantled the pillars, which had been crushed by the downward weight, threaded steels through them, and then rebuilt them again. And you would not be able to tell, unless you're told about it, you can't even see the difference there on site. Now, huge intervention. Whether we'd even consider that now is another question, but it's the reason it's still standing up and hasn't done that in the longer term. So really bold stuff, and there's one of the pillars hollowed out at the bottom. You can see where the core of it's been cut out to take the steel stanchion. We've probably never even entertained this as a proposal now, but these people were working blind. They were pioneers. It's easy to criticize in hindsight. And by the same virtue, other side of the same wall. So this was all going on, all this arch was going on over here, and this great girder roof just to brace the two structures apart. So again, it's still there now, still doing a job. leaded rather than tiled, because again, the tiles were pushing the outer wall over still. So really, really big, bold pieces of work. And you can see this all over the building. So you've got a couple of things. Might have one later on. We've got this incredibly hard cement point, cementitious pointing. We call it the ministry mix at work. The Scots deal with it, the Irish deal with it. Everything was centralised in the early 20th century. Portland cement, breed and gravel, and you could put it in the car park. You can just batter it through the surface of the car park with a mallet, and the car park will come off second best. Very, very hard. Not necessarily suitable by today's standards, but again, it's the reason it's still there, and some of it has done a job. But you can see the level of intervention. We've got lead sleeves, we've got pins, we've got straps and bands holding the structure together. The legacy act period is the monument we see today, effectively. It's still standing. Okay. So you've got to be very wary when you're dealing with a building like this, what's actually happened before you. Are you about to try and treat something for the fourth or fifth time and cause more damage, or will it just not work at all? So this is the central the crossing I was telling you about. So the ring beam's hidden under there, you can't tell. Here's the pointing, massive cement pointing. Things like this quite convincing looking little turret, Carnarvon arch on top. It's not there 30 years earlier. Very limited records of some of this. And then, as Rhys will show you, dressing, features on the ground, things like, is that the high altar, small altar bases, that looks like a flower garden. We thought it was a flower bed at first. We were still not convinced it isn't. But these things happen. They did take some liberties that we can't actually find the evidential base for. Which gives us, the classic guardianship monument. Apparently very solid walls, aren't going anywhere, stuck together with sand cement. Grassy lawns, the gravel in between. And this is the sort of tourist attraction we know today. So the problem, 5 minutes before we pass on to Rhys, is this. The stone has effectively, in a lot of cases, reached the end of its lifespan, or at least in its current form. So soft local sandstone, quarried from various locations in the White Valley, the traditional site on Barbados Wood above the hill, above the Abbey on the hill. The Barbados, we think, is a local inability to spell Barbados. It must be an nice sound, it's a little Welsh sort of warping of an English word for a Caribbean island. It's got a strange name. But then you have all manner of problems, very soft stone and damage from a number of different agencies. The problem being that this is a visitor attraction. People are walking around in it, and you have bits like this falling down. You've been hit, haven't you, Rhys? When you were doing the archaeology, everybody does. Whether it's your thumbnail, or it's your fist, or it's a house brick, it's going to hurt you from 30 meters up. So after a very effective period of lobbying from Pascal Bidois, our excellent head custodian, started logging the falls. This is a couple of months worth of fall, large and small. It's color-coded, some of it's detail, some of it's just like flakes. You can see where that one's come from there. Just to help us get our senior manager's head around the idea that we cannot ignore this. We have to do something about it. So the church was shut and the project proper began. And that's just an example of, what can come down. So, it's not a case of neglect. You can't scaffold up 30 meters every year, year after year. But this one just fell vertically from this hole here. And, it's just inevitable. We've got the same problem everywhere on our estate. Scots have got the same, the English have got the same. And we're shutting monuments all over the British Isles for exactly the same reason. And we just cannot hold this stuff up against the will of gravity and sort of its lifespan. So first, very, very quickly, first job was to deal with the worst stuff so you could work inside it safely. This Ibex Technical Access, Raglan firm, who were brilliant. You can send them anywhere. They'll do anything, any location. A construction firm would just do very, very difficult work in difficult locations. In this case, it was a combination of cherry pickers and climbing, just to get up on the wall heads and the upper walls and literally just wipe across the top of them, take all the latest vegetation out, repoint voids in a suitable mix, just to make sure there's nothing particularly obvious falling down while we sort of worked out how we were going to start investigating it properly. And then this principle of research-led conservation for the project proper. We need to deal with this problem of falling laminate in masonry. It's not new. The records in the 1920s, 30s, 50s, 60s, 70s. It's just landed on us now that they really are getting to the point where it's quite critical. It's not just this sort of gentle background drizzle. So rather than just, you don't bob the builder into doing these projects or even our own masons, this is research-led, informed conservation. So, looking at in detail at the conservation history of the site, what's been done in the past, what's it tell us about what's been done, how does it affect the structure, the materials that have been used, then a condition survey through the masonry specialists, the conservation specialists to tell us where are the problems, how do we address them, taking that into account. A lot of building archaeology, understand the significance of the structure we're about to start messing about with, and then large-scale archaeological evaluation of the ground, which seems quite tangential at the moment. You're looking at upstanding walls. So it's an iterative process. So the design of the entire project has changed and been tweaked with each piece of new information that comes in. Archaeology is the obvious pile of new information, but there are lots and lots of other ones. Even as our clerk of works crawls across the scaffold and spots new details, everything just gets fed back into the end game. And then also a collegiate approach: assemble the best possible people, the best range of experts you can find, work in a team from lots of different specialisms, so no one person has that sway to say this is the narrative for Tintern Abbey. So we've got everything from building historians, archaeologists, geologists working for us at the same time, and we've scoured for the people that we really need. And then finally, the whole dissemination of information, which is an ongoing process. And at the end of the project, there'll be the publications and so on. Quite a bit of media already, but we're trying to avoid it while we find our feet, really. So finally, this involves a lot of briefs for lots of different people. So here we are. This is conservation research, David Robinson. And then we've got archaeological building recording. And this is the first step, of course. You need the baseline drawings. So this is photogrammetric surveys. You've got laser scans as well. So you record the building as much detail as you possibly can. These elevations, they're complex sort of amalgams of thousands of photographs, but you can zoom right in, and these form the baseline for everything we work on. So it's the architects marking up plans, or our conservators saying, okay, treat that stone in that way. The masons mark them up, the archaeologists mark them up. Everybody uses these as a reference set. So we'll be draping, rather than doing new drawings again and again and again, draping layers in CAD, whatever graphic software we're using, one on top of the other, so we can compare and contrast both past work, present work, and future work. To do that, you've got to have a naming convention. Lots of big monotonous elevations. They all look pretty much the same. We've all been there on this project. You turn an elevation around, move it slightly to one side. Which window am I looking at now? They're all different. You get to know and love them all individually, every blemish and every stone. But for people coming in this after us, we have to be systematic. And we also need to find a way to stack up our research in a coherent manner so we can refer to things and find them. What happened to this in 1930, or who did something here at some point in the past? This is David Robinson scribbling an early draft of our system, which has become far more complex and alphanumeric. I think it's probably better describing it. So first person in, David Robinson. So they've mentioned him before, guidebook, sort of internationally known expert on this kind of thing, worked for Historic England in the sort of English heritage in their sort of research team for decades, after a period at Cadw publications team. So he's written the textbooks, wrote the guidebook, and has written just about everything else there is to read on Tintern Abbey. The only person we really wanted to look at the historical research was basically it's got to be David. So it's partly the building itself, which is written to death, but also what have we done to this building? We've got the longest conservation history of any structure in Wales, and it's spread across many, many different areas, many different places, receptacles. So unpublished sources, Ministry of Works, Cadw, modern Cadw records. You've got everything from detailed drawings of who did what and when, and then things that are barely legible. And most of the information in these W118 foreman's reports, doctor writing, explaining what they did, but not necessarily where and why. Thousands of pages of these to sift through. And this stuff spread from Yale out to bits of Russia, unbelievably. Somebody sent us some stuff from there showing pictures of their granddad working on Tintern Abbey and anything. It might just be one docket from an inspector saying, yes, Piers, I think we should do that because that will stop that. That's the evidence in some cases. We don't want to be falling into that trap again. So it's all been dragged together. David will provide a series of drawings with our project, our building archaeologist, Ross Cook, which will effectively be what happened, where and when. It's a good set of layers there. And he's there also on hand to advise on any aspect of Cistercian archaeology and life that can come across right the way through the excavations, even the conservation works. We're doing this. Is this authentic? Can you think of a better parallel? How can you explain it? And again, just examples of some of the types of material we deal with. Photographs, I think these are from former Soviet Union. Somebody's granddad working on a warhead came through a few months ago. And just, all those sources, the antiquarian pits, there must be millions of photographs of Tintern Abbey. So I won't go on about it in any more detail. And the outcome is a series of these rather masterly tomes, which David's producing. They're all grey literature at the moment. One's a couple of 100 pages long. We've got site bibliography, so anything that's happened, grey literature or published literature, we have it in there. It's been added to constantly. Burials, when the archaeology started, where are they? What do we know? And David's put that together for us. I'll leave another 5 in and I'll give Rhys more time after that then, yeah. So the next thing, we're doing a background research, who did what, where and when, and we're on to the actual masonry, what the problems are. So again, leading people got his MB last year, David Odgers Conservation, decades as a sort of leading masonry conservator, churches, big houses for all of the state bodies and beyond, based in Glastonbury, and his partner in crime, Angus. Never seen anyone get so angry with a bad trial panel of mortar. I'll kick it to pieces, not having that, sort of thing. And these are the dynamic duo who've basically been brought in to tell us what are the problems. So I've got an advisory report. This is effectively the specification of works, but as one longhand report. This became the end spec for the project, and how they got that information and worked out what was going on was firstly previous research. So David Robinson's seen this. I've been looking at this. You've all been looking at older pieces of work, the source of the building stones, Lott and Barclay. Got more stuff from British Geological Survey, and again, lots of previous attempts by Cadw to address the chemical processes going on in the stones and causing this level of lamination. Former colleagues, so former works, Alan Cornish, retired a few years ago, Tony Gwynn, so they actually led the works on the Abbey in the past. Tells us a lot about things like horrible briefane impregnations on stones high up in the nave, and seems in one of the transepts too. Tony gave us this, which certainly we didn't have on file, showing all these different paintings. So what you do is you paint this stuff on. It's a silica-based sort of goo, and it seals the face of the stone. 50 years later, we're finding that, well, when it works, it's a slightly sort of laminated appearance, sort of almost like shiny appearance. But when it does go wrong, the whole front of the stone laminates off, not just the back bit. But elsewhere, seems to be perfectly viable. We're still getting to grips with what some of these methods are doing to our monuments, but we wouldn't have known some of this. It would for them being around to say, well, I did that when I was a lad. This is first week on site. He was up a ladder with no breathing equipment to deal with that. 1980s. Odgers' method, back to the cherry picker. It's a MUP, a walking one. Just moving the pads around to walk about the nave on in the winter were enough of an exercise, but gets them right to the top. And they have literally tapped every single stone, wiggled every stone, the good old-fashioned wiggle test. Hammer tapping, is it hollow? Does it move? Can you visually tell it's in a state? And we end up with a whole series of problems being identified. So surface lamination, so this water getting into the front of the stones, freeze-thaw action taking place, and again, just splits off. You'll see it's on any red sandstone in the national park and beyond. It's particularly acute at Tintern because it's very, very soft. So this is common on all sorts of scales, tiny and massive. We've got sort of perimeter lamination here. Again, you've got a very hard mortar. Oh, there we are. Some Ministry of Works cementitious pebbly mortar here. Water can't escape through that, so it's coming out of the arises, the edges of the stones there, sort of crumbling away. Straight erosion, so it's a combination of factors, very hard mortars here surviving, wind eddying, potentially water bursting out. And sometimes all of these agencies combined into one stone. You see great big holes coming right the way through. And then finally bedding. So this is looking down at the top of a little ocular window. All of the dress stuff is being cut along the sort of bedding plane because it's easier to cut that way. So when it gets wet, the water's come straight into the top of the stone. It does that. Very, very common problem. And then all sorts of previous conservation and more things, previous conservation work. So copper bands to hold these soft yellow sandstone columns in place. Where they work like this, they're fine. Others, the stone moves around inside them. It just exacerbates that freeze-thaw, wet-dry problem. And it is probably the hottest and coldest and wettest and driest place in the entire valley. So freeze-thaw is always exacerbated. Everything's worse at height in the Abbey. General sporing, so surface moisture, salts in the stone. So this low-grade sort of weathering away, and then fractures from the pressure of the structure above combined with weakened stones. And this changes from stone to stone. No two do exactly the same thing. So it's not just a case of looking at one single solution. And then contributing factors, very hard historic mortars, more ministry mix. Go and look at one of our sites and you'll see this stuff everywhere. It's very, very distinct. If I add more material, if you could reproduce it for some other use, it'd be brilliant. Incredibly soft sandstone. Again, you can see different beds from yellows to greens to reds. Out of the same sets of quarries, one stone will be brilliant. The next one will be just powder a few years later. So you cannot predict the behavior of everything. And then climate change making things worse. It's very, very wet site. It's always slightly misted. Discovered that the northern side of the site, which you'd expect to be worse, probably worse weather, it's actually okay because it stays moderately damp throughout the year. And the freeze thaws all affecting the sides that are exposed to sun as it swings around. Things like that. And you end up with these series of elevations, again, the same baseline drawings, showing a multitude of problems and a set of solutions. So a couple more slides before I hand to Rhys. So what do you do about it all? you don't just set up, get the same mix that you used at the last monument and crack on. It doesn't work that way. Obviously, a much more sensitive, touchy-feely approach required. Everything comes back to Cadw's conservation principles. Nothing we've been doing at Tintern has been particularly innovative. It's just the sheer scale of the building and the sort of the gravity of the different problems has been the issue, really. So drastic range in condition, sort of conclusions, multiple agents of decay, need for flexible approach. So you cannot specify every stone in an entire wall of a masonry contractor because you will never finish anything. The usual all chestnuts of minimum intervention to retain as much historic fabric as possible, avoid causing further damage. Sympathetic materials, so pulling out things like copper alloy bands and steels and replace them with extruded basalt pins, inert materials that do the same job in terms of carrying weight and rigidity. Softer bachelor line mortars, not the sand and cement, although we have reverted that in places. And then removing damaging or failed modern repairs. We can't hack out the cementitious mortars, you destroy the building. So it's a case of working sensitively around them. And the whole thing is a process of discovery, recording and analysing the structures, materials, and materials as work progresses. And then the other sort of pre-excavation piece of work, really, and the reason for excavation coming up now, record the building. So it's a building archaeologist up on a scaffold. Ross Cook, I think he's the best in the country by some distance. From the Royal Commission, been independent, contract for quite some time, does most of the recording on our estate at the moment. Absolute box of tricks. Cathedral archaeologist for Canterbury, St Davies, Wells, and he was the obvious contender to come and record this building with David Robinson to guide him and the rest of the team. So Ross's job will be firstly the pre-works record, you'll do David's drawings as well, all of these just layers in an AutoCAD model effectively, and then he'll be the man on the scaffold when he has been the man on the scaffold while the works have been going on. Just examples of the detailed plaster, date stones that you can spot. And again, list of his tasks, we'll watch through that. That's what a building archaeologist does. And Ross will also be producing the post-works record as well. So when we leave this, we won't have the same problem of what on earth did they do in the past. There's absolutely no excuses with the technology today. So list of treatments recommended by Odgers and Co. It's like pinning, pointing, propping. None of it particularly groundbreaking, but to do that, to get up that height, you need a scaffold. Now, this is a 1930s scaffold again. Look at that ladder. There's nowhere there. The locals all tell us about various elderly relatives who used to go up the top, and most of the kids in Tintern have been up on the Abbey without a scaffold. Yeah. Difference between this and what we're doing now is building regulations, health and safety. You can't build something that high anymore without sort of quadrupling or whatever the 10 times magnitude equivalent to that is instead. So two specialists in, Tad Scaffold Design the thing, and Tia, who've actually built the thing from Swansea. These are probably the biggest meetings we've had on site. Everyone and their dog, structural engineers, people with weight-bearing experts. How do you cantilever something over the top? Well, we've got a bloke who worked in South America on that. We're bringing it over for us. It's the way these things work. Basically, how do you put that up? Without just leaning on the building. It's got to be free of the structure. Can't rely on the structure itself. And you have this long process, and you come up with an initial design. In this case, this is the East End. So where am I standing? You can just see here, I think there are about 250 uprights mooted in the first draft at the east end of the church alone. This is the Great East Window. This is about a fifth of the building. About 250, of which the loading weight's estimated were 80 tons on some of the downhill ones further up, to about 4 or 5 in some of the higher ones. You can't really be doing that on top of a pile of archaeology with the knowledge we have now. So first thing you do, well, let's find out where the archaeology is. No formal excavation done at Tintern, apart from the Ministry of Works grubbing around looking for walls to mark out on the ground for the Norman church. So you go through your geophysics, the usual hoops. This started sometime in advance. What method works the best? This is the Roseviers of Tiger Geo. Various trials, and opted for pretty much GPR, ground penetrating radar everywhere. And just to chop plot, you get lots of reflections, as you'd expect in the east end of an Abbey church. It's stuff full of burials. What a surprise. Depth indicating some of these, a matter of a foot or so below the floor, some possibly more, some possibly less. Stone graves, straight burials. Complex results, but enough to show us that it's not enough just to rely on this to be able to put the scaffold up and design it around it. So you have to go a bit further, which takes us on to, archaeological potential. What have we got? Well, we know we've got an earlier church, supposedly parked on the ground. We've got 500 years of monastic life. The first church, the internal and external burials associated with it, its external buildings, all of those monks, all those lay brothers. We've got the second church, the construction process there, the demolition of the first, the structures you'd expect to see inside. So we know of the great pulpit and screen knocked out by the Victorians. We've got missing screens in all of the arcades between the different arches. We've got various altars on the ground, which look increasingly less convincing as we sort of start clearing the site off. Things that may have been bits of the high altar, ministry of work, so we don't know. So clearly there's a lot to be wary of before you just start putting up scaffolding any old how. So here we go, some dubious stuff here. You can see these later features, but they're an indication of what you might expect to find inside an Abbey church anyway. Again, mentioned burials, artifacts. So we don't have much in terms of finds from Tintern Abbey. Most of it taken away from site, ended in various museums, but you would expect there to be encaustic tile floors. We know of multiple sort of pieces of monumental grave furniture and mouldings from the rest of the church that haven't already been stacked up outside. So lots of things potentially to find, archaeology to disturb. So you don't take this lightly. What you don't want at the end of the day, and this is the final slide before we pass on to Rhys, we don't want is to have pieces of a very expensive modern scaffold collapsing into voids. So buried chest tombs, soft soil, and so on, backfill features. We've got people like William Herbert of Raglan, son, nature hunting in there. At least 3 of the marshals in there. The great and the good of South East Wales' gentry, effectively, are in that building or have been in that building. Plus the abbots, the sort of high officials in the church, anybody buried within the building. Associated with 2 successive churches. So the one sitting on the other, probably on the other one's graveyard. So have to look at this in a way that we get meaningful information out. And we thought, well, having seen a lot of these go wrong, not just on Cadw guardianship sites, but for local authority projects too, where effectively you see a series of test pits dug along scaffold upright. So a metre square, what are you coming down onto? You just see something's unintelligible on its own. And they just dig another pit and another pit and another trench and another trench. So, well, in this case, why not add something to the canon and go for a full-scale area evaluation of the east end of the church? So see this in plan, so you can see it in context. So we're not just compromising the archaeology by exposing it and not understanding it. We're taking the information away with us. Lots of internal debate about this approach. I think common sense prevailed in that we would never, and Rhys will follow this, that we would never have understood a single thing we were looking at from test pits inside the Abbey. It's just about the whole post-dissolution archaeology of the Abbey. It looks like it's been dug up, put in a cement mix and just spread around the floor on top of the late medieval strata. So the final section, aims and objectives. Here's Rhys's colleague, Richard Lewis. It's Ross Cook, building archaeologist. Aim and objectives to inform the scaffold design, avoid and mitigate impacts on buried archaeology. Second one, area evaluation, not trenching. It's an evaluation, not an excavation, which is purely to drop onto the top of the archaeological levels, record, understand their distribution, redesign accordingly. But with additional trenching on the request of the structural engineers to see whether the ground is actually compact enough to take the scaffold in. So some bigger trenches cut through that. Not a research excavation. I'll say that again. This wasn't a jolly, wasn't a decision taken lightly, but undertaking the highest possible standard to extract the maximum amount of information by the best possible contractors, with this sort of collegiate team of experts working with them to help interpret and understand. And features, burials and deposits only excavated where this is unavoidable, where the structural pits, exposing the top of a burial, it will be crushed if you bury it again. So lift it out, they'll go back and be buried again later. And then over to Rhys, I suppose. Now this is the 2 phases. So you have the East End is a 5-phase project of 5 years. You decide to get the archaeology ahead of programme by digging all that in one go. Rhys will tell you about the trauma of attempting a hand excavation of this half of the East End. It's a solid packed cementitious mess. But the end result is a redesigned scaffold that then avoids the key archaeology, which is where I'll stop, hand over to Rhys. And is that ready to go? Good. Yeah.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yep. Okay, my name is Rhys Morgan, and I work as Project Officer for Black Mountains Archaeology. As a member of Black Mountains Archaeology, I took part in the archaeological evaluation within the interior of the Great Church at Tintern Abbey, as well as in preparation for the conservation works. So my talk will basically outline the results of the evaluation, and I'll put forward some preliminary interpretations as well. And here's a beautiful aerial photograph of the Abbey with a great church in the middle, which really kind of captures the dramatic atmosphere of the site and its position within the Wye Valley. So Will has covered this. It's worth briefly summarizing the sort of the timeline of the phasing of what's going on here, which is very, very complicated, as Will has said. But it's worth reiterating there's two basic phases. So there's the earlier church, which we've called Tintern 1, and there's the later Great Church, which we've called Tintern 2. So I'll be referring to these two phases in the following slides. So the archaeological evaluation undertaken last year by us was divided into two parts. Phase 1 excavations began on the 2nd of May 2023 and concluded on the 21st of July 2023. Investigations involved the stripping of an area measuring 719 meters squared, covering the presbytery, the south transept and crossing, along with the south aisle of the presbytery, east chapel area of the south transept, and rear chapel area beyond the presbytery. The exterior foundations were also stripped at the south-east corner. Beyond stripping, 8 trenches were also opened on both the interior and exterior of the church. A total of 178 tons of material was excavated. 16 inhumations, or human bodies, if you want, were uncovered, and 12 of these were lifted out of the ground for further analysis. These remains were also accompanied by 40 litres of disarticulated human skeletal fragments. Large quantities of late 13th and early 14th century encaustic tiles were also recorded. And during phase 1, Dawn Bowden, who was then the Deputy Minister for Arts, Sports and Tourism, visited the site, and she seemed very enthusiastic about the project. And at the bottom of the screen here is a short sort of time lapse of us stripping the topsoil. It gives you some idea of the initial work that was involved prior to the real excavations. The phase 2 and 3 excavations began on the 29th of August 2023 and concluded just before Christmas, the 22nd of December. These investigations involved the stripping of an area measuring 680 meters squared, covering again the presbytery, but this time the north transept, east chapel, as well as the book room slash vestry, which is kind of on the top. The exterior foundations were also stripped to the north and east of the church, as well as the area surrounding the infirmary passage, which kind of leads into the church on this oblique angle here. Oh, this is the vestry and book room here as well. Beyond stripping, 3 trenches were opened up along with various test pits, and the east chapel area, the north transept, was partially excavated after stripping. Perhaps the most exciting part of this phase was parts of Tintern 1 were discovered, so the earliest church. In addition, the foundations of an unusual building were recorded at the north end of the north transept. In total, 224 tons of material was excavated, 10 inhumations were recorded, and 3 of these were lifted for further analysis. Also, 4 significant tombs were identified. And again, large quantities of late 13th, early 14th century encaustic floor tiles were recorded, as well as a kind of faux tile floor in the north transept, which was likely assembled in the 19th century. So now I'm going to focus specifically on the findings made during the archaeological evaluation of both phases that were associated directly with the earliest Tintern 1 church. So a curious looking stretch of walling was recorded during the excavations of the north aisle of the Great Church Presbytery and immediately south of the infirmary passage. The wall was apparently L-shaped and was, as you can see, markedly thick. Stratigraphically, the walling also predated the construction of the Great Church. In considering the location of the walling, it's been interpreted as forming part of the presbytery attached to Tintern 1. Or more specifically, it appears it was situated towards the southeast corner of Tintern 1's presbytery. For further clarity, here is the estimated footprint of Tintern 1 up here. This is based on the work of David Robinson, and here's the walling we uncovered here. So just south of the infirmary passage. Within the East Chapel area of the North Transept of the Great Church again, another stretch of walling associated with Tintern 1 was recorded. In terms of position, the wall appeared to form the north end of an earlier church and was east-west aligned. Structurally and dimensionally, the wall married well with the one just mentioned in the previous slide, which confirmed a kind of contemporaneity between the two. As you can see here, the wall is again markedly thick. The wall would have formed the north section of Tintern 1's presbytery. One of the more interesting aspects of the wall was the lack of northward return. If the earlier church had clearly defined north transepts, as indicated by the plan here, then a northward return would be expected. Is it then possible that Tintern 1 possessed a north transept that was less kind of formally defined than previously thought, or was the northward return demolished prior to our excavation of the site? Certainly, our investigations have provided much sort of food for thought on this matter. So here's a plan demonstrating the assumed footprint of Tintern 1 in relation to the archaeological evidence. As you can see, the east-west aligned stretch of wall discovered during excavations matches nicely with the assumed north presbytery wall, but no northward return was present. Initially, through the work of Harold Breakspear in 1904, it was thought that Tintern 1 possessed relatively shallow transepts, each of which contained single chapels. By the end of the 1920s, this view was revised, and it was thought instead that the transepts were markedly deeper, containing perhaps two chapels rather than one. In considering the archaeological evidence that we've uncovered, it's likely that the supposed plan of Tintern will need to be revised again. Also, it's worth mentioning that remnants of plaster were discovered on the south side of Tintern 1's presbytery wall, implying that the south end was the interior of the earlier Tintern 1 Romanesque church. Flooring deposits associated with Tintern 1 were also recorded during excavations. This flooring was recognized partly by the level at which it lay, which is a kind of uniform 13.45 meters OD. So, for example, a stretch of flagstone floor was uncovered on the south edge of Nicholas of Llandaff's tomb, which is basically this here. Situated within the footprint of the Great Church's crossing, while a similar stretch of flooring was uncovered on the north edge of the church's crossing. It should also be mentioned that excavations conducted within the crossing area revealed mostly internal features associated with Tintern 1, including the tomb of Nicholas itself, which would occupy quite a prominent role within the Romanesque church. Excavations conducted at the north transept of the Great Church also revealed that an east-west aligned north wall that was associated with Tintern 1 again, which was partly truncated by a later high-status tomb, which is this thing here, which is quite mysterious, actually. We definitely weren't expecting this. I'll discuss this later, as it belongs to Tintern 2. Perhaps the most tantalizing discovery associated with Tintern 1 was towards the northern exterior of the Great Church. So as you can see in these photos, excavations were initially made along the buttress foundations, but we were also asked to dig an approximately north-south aligned trench, which is well, it's basically all of this excavation here. Two features of note are recorded. An east-west aligned wall, which ran parallel with the Great Church's north wall. That's this here. And the remains of another building, which is this here, only partially uncovered. Neither of these features were known prior to the commencement of the evaluation. Both features appear to predate the construction of the Great Church. This stratigraphic relationship is implied by the abrupt termination of the east-west running wall, with the abrupt nature of this termination suggesting it was truncated during the construction of the later Great Church, or Tintern II. But the stratigraphic relationship is indicated more accurately by the fact that the east-west wall runs directly beneath and is therefore earlier than the infirmary passage, which is just out of shot here. The east-west running wall had a box drain incorporated into it, and we sampled the contents of this box drain. On the south side of the wall, near the short return, the remains of an apparent hearth were found, indicating, at least in a kind of vague manner, I suppose, the kinds of activities that were being conducted there. The remains of the other building, so the one that's kind of partially uncovered there, were very difficult to interpret. As you can see, the building was truncated by a 20th century drainage pipe. Within this area, two medieval jetons were discovered, which were basically kind of medieval counting tokens. Here's one of my colleagues, top left, Charlie, looking very excited, having just found one. The jetons haven't been firmly dated yet, but they're certainly medieval in date. It was suggested that one of these earlier buildings may have formed some kind of counting house due to the proximity of the jetons, but this is obviously a very tentative idea at the moment. Also discovered in this area was a King Henry III short cross penny dating to between 1216 and 1272. The penny was minted in Bury St Edmunds in East Anglia. The penny is possibly contemporary with the construction of the Great Church. And actually, your average kind of skilled labourer who worked building the Great Church would have been paid 1.5 of these a day. So that's kind of why it's been cut in half. So to reiterate, these two buildings can stratigraphically at least be dated to the Tintern I phase. On the opposite side of the Great Church, towards the southeast corner, further excavations were made in the form of two trenches, which were dug following the exposing of the exterior foundations at this end. Within both trenches, human burials were found. In the southernmost trench, the remains of two inhumations were recorded, both articulated, while the remains of a charnel pit, which is this here, were also recorded within their vicinity. At this stage, only the legs of the two inhumations were uncovered. The charnel pit contained several skulls as well as a variety of other bones. In the easternmost trench, the apparent remains of another charnel pit were discovered, although this particular pit wasn't fully excavated. It did, however, contain quantities of human bone, as you might expect. Stratigraphically, the two in situ inhumations, you see the legs there, were contemporary with Tintern I, as their graves cut into a ground surface that was undisturbed by later construction and landscaping activities associated with Tintern II. The charnel pits are also cut into this same surface, but the disarticulated nature of the remains they contained would imply that the individuals from which the bones derived were dug up during the construction or landscaping associated with the Great Church. The remains were then placed inside the charnel pits. It can therefore be assumed that the fragmented individuals here were basically in the way, and they needed to be removed and put somewhere else. But it must be remembered that according to this hypothesis, although the remains were redeposited during the Tintern II phase, the remains themselves were originally interred during the Tintern I phase, or the use of Tintern I, and therefore they may be as early as the 12th century. So as I previously mentioned, excavations were conducted around the tomb of Nicholas of Llandaff. Although the tomb is presently situated within the crossing of the Great Church, the tomb was originally, in its original setting, was at the south transept of Tintern 1. As his name suggests, Nicholas served as precentor and treasurer of Llandaff, roles which he held between 1191 and 1218, which was the date of his death. So here the tomb is east-west aligned in typical fashion, as can be seen from the two black and white photos taken in the early 20th century. The tomb was already sustained archaeological investigation. More specifically, the tomb was investigated between 1919 and 1920 by the Office of Works, which Will has kind of summarized. The tomb was opened at this time, revealing the remains of Nicholas himself. He was wrapped in a shroud made out of coarse wool. Our excavations were concentrated mainly towards the south of the tomb, so that's the top right photo up there. Here we uncovered a stretch of flagstones, which I've previously mentioned. One of these married well with the photo on the left, so basically it's the same surface that was uncovered. What was also evident was the extent to which the tomb had been, let's say, modified during the 20th century, presumably following the excavations exhibited by the black and white photos. For example, the sides have been reinforced or basically almost crudely infilled with sandstone rubble, as you can see in the top right photograph. Well, it appears that the grave marker has also been raised quite significantly above the level at which it originally sat, or at least sat when this was opened up in 1919, 1920. Also, there's some debate as to whether the grave marker that's now present in the Great Church today is the same one as the one in the early 20th century photographs, because they appear quite different, really. There are more examples of Tintern 1 inhumations, this time within the footprint of the Great Church's presbytery. The remains possessed varying degrees of preservation. Some were very well preserved, others not so much, as you can see. The interment of these burials predated the construction of the Great Church. It would have been placed within a cemetery positioned towards the southeast exterior of Tintern 1. But a couple of these inhumations, positioned towards the east end of the crossing, may have been situated in the footprint of Tintern 1 itself. This stratigraphic relationship is demonstrated by the fact that the burials and the ground surface within which they were interred was sealed by a thin layer of sandstone, which served as the working surface of Tintern 2. In other words, this surface represented a kind of temporary layer on which masons, laborers, etc., did their construction work and kind of mixed their materials. The layer was very ephemeral. Unfortunately, you can't really see it very well in these photos. The relationship between the earlier burials and the later Great Church is demonstrated in a particularly striking way on the photo on the right, where the individual is effectively, taken out by this big pier that's kind of on top of him. Again, here are some more examples of Tintern 1 burials situated within the footprint of the Great Church. The thin green sandstone deposit, or the working layer as we've called it, slightly more clear here. So just about kind of see, it's this here. But you really got to get your eye in to kind of see that. This is obviously better to be on site. It's basically composed of sandstone chippings, and it, as I've said, it seals the Tintern 1 burials, meaning it must have been deposited after the burials were interred. So now let's turn to the archaeological features and deposits associated with Tintern 2. As can be seen from this aerial photograph, some of the most significant architectural features discovered during the evaluation were the foundations, which were uncovered towards the exterior of the Great Church within the buttress trenches that we excavated. That's these here. So to summarize, they were absolutely enormous. On average, the foundations incorporated into the south side, so that's the side that you can't really see at the moment, were around 2 meters wide, but the foundation situated at the southeast corner measured in excess of 5 meters in width. And here's some photographs of the exposed foundations. They were relatively variable in terms of construction, with some being composed of large sandstone blocks, while others were composed, like the one at the bottom right, they're composed of sort of slabs, like layered slabs. But it must be remembered that many of the foundations have been exposed during the 20th century, and some of them have actually been rebuilt. This was evidenced mainly by, as Will's touched on, the cement mortar that they were kind of rebuilt with. Towards the area on the north side, situated by this trench to be opened up here, which I've already mentioned, it's kind of this area. Was a large deposit of broken medieval window glass. Some examples of this glass can be seen bottom left. I think that's Ross's hand there. Yeah, I know it doesn't really look much like glass than that, but it's been so kind of degraded over time. It's sort of laminate is extremely fragile. The presence of such large amounts of glass in one place may be due to possibly to the smashing of the Great Church window, which is kind of overlooking that area, which we would assume would have happened in the 16th century when acid stripping was going on. So during the evaluation, it was possible to establish a general construction phase for the Great Church. Firstly, the area within which the church was to be constructed was stripped and leveled down to a depth of around 0.8 meters. Secondly, columns and pier bases were constructed. Thirdly, that crushed green sandstone layer was deposited across the whole of the interior, which formed, like I said, a working surface on which construction workers could operate. The relationship between the green working surface and the column or pier bases was demonstrated by the fact that in the majority of instances, not all instances, but the majority of instances, the green sandstone abutted the piers. Now, obviously, post-dated, so the piers are put in first, then the green sandstone was put down. Situated immediately below the green deposit, and obviously being sealed by it, was the demolition material that was accumulated when Tintern 1 went out of use. It appears that it was being, as Will said, it was being demolished in stages as the Great Church was being constructed and even used. Finally, many of the later graves associated with the Great Church of Tintern 2 cut through the green deposit. The cutting of the green sandstone was a key indicator of the grave's position within the stratigraphy or phasing sequence of the overall building. Towards the north end of the Great Church is the book room and vestry, both of which are sandwiched between the north transept to the south and the cloister range to the north. The book room occupies the west end, while the vestry occupies the east end. So clarity. Yes, it's this here. The book room was stripped, and a trench was excavated down the middle, which is this. A chunk of the vestry, however, had to remain unexplored. Perhaps surprisingly, the trench it had nothing in it. It was void of significant archaeological deposits. Well, for the most part, although 2 stretches of medieval walling were recorded. Firstly, there was the foundation of an apparent partition wall between the book room and the vestry. You just about see that here. This. Secondly, there was an unusual curved, almost column-like foundation situated immediately below the doorway linking the north transept of the Great Church with the book room. That's this here. The purpose of this foundation at present is unknown. I mean, it's entirely possible it was associated with Tintern 1. If so, it would have been situated within the footprint of the earlier church's north transept. It's also worth mentioning that stonework revealed at the west end of the trench was 20th century in date, and it was, yeah, as expected, it was bonded with cement mortar. So that's this here. The stonework was constructed during the restoration of the book room's kind of Gothic doorway at the east end. So, traveling back to the northern exterior of the great church, a small section of the infirmary passage was excavated towards what's currently the principal entrance to the church. So again, that's, yeah, this. Also, an elongated strip towards the western edge of the passage was excavated. The infirmary passage basically connected the great church, as you might expect, to the infirmary, which is to the exterior. On the west edge of the passage, a lot of post-medieval demolition or waste material was encountered. But within this material, there were the remains of dumbbell column bases, like you top left here. Although out of context, these findings suggest that the infirmary passage was defined on either side by these kinds of architectural features. Other examples of these are on display towards the abbot's house. Although these again are kind of out of context, they've been put there. It's just as on display, really. Also found within the post-medieval material were perforated roof tiles composed of sandstone, as well as 14th century ridge tiles, sometimes known as dragon's tooth or dragon's back tiles, due to that angular and crested form. And that's this thing here. So again, we can imagine the infirmary passage in its kind of original form being defined by these kinds of materials. In terms of inhumations, a total of 10 individuals were recorded during the evaluation that can be positively identified as belonging to Tintern 2. 3 of these individuals were lifted for further analysis and sent to Cardiff University. 4 of the 10 inhumations were of markedly high status, as signified by the stone coffins they were placed inside. On the screen is perhaps the most interesting example, and we call this guy the Oxhide Man. He's situated towards the north aisle of the presbytery. As you can see from the early 20th century photo on the right, this individual was, again, previously investigated, during which time his oxide was, I would say, markedly intact. It's very clear in that photo. During our excavations, his coffin was revealed and exposed again. Interestingly, the northern side of the coffin was composed of a reused coffin lid, which is this here. And we know that's a reused coffin lid because of its chamfered edges. Although we didn't open up the coffin, we were able to partially examine its interior with an endoscope. As we can see in the photo on the bottom left, or just about see, he's still there, and the oxide partially survives, although it's significantly decomposed compared to as you can see the photos on the right there. The inclusion of an oxide is a marker of very, very high status indeed. Other notable oxide bearers include Henry I, Robert Insler, who was Bishop of Durham, and Prince Edward of Scotland, who was the son of Malcolm III. Died in 1093. On the opposite south aisle of the presbytery was another high-status burial. It was again kind of remarkably intact. Unlike the Oxide Man, this burial had not been previously investigated or exposed. Again, he put an endoscope into his tomb, and here are the results on the left. The individual contained within the coffin appears physically robust. He also had a very, very good diet, I suppose. Within the east aisle of the north transept was another well-preserved inhumation. The grave for this individual cut through the disturbed flagstone floor, which was associated with Tintern 1. During examinations of the skeleton, it was noticed that the individual was potentially positioned above an earlier grave cut, which is quite curious. So this, in conjunction with the noticeably disturbed position of the skull, as you can see in the foot on the right, suggests that the individual had been disturbed after interment. Obviously, this is very difficult to determine what actually occurred, but I suppose it opens up the possibility for activities like grave robbing, possibly, like the removal of jewelry from graves. This of course, is a tentative idea. Nearby, situated directly within the north transept of the Great Church, were the foundations of the elaborate tomb up there, which I've mentioned previously. The tomb appeared to comprise a grave accompanied by a memorial on its south side. So that's the big kind of structure there that you see. The tomb, unfortunately, wasn't opened by us. There therefore exists a lot of debate as to who was actually who was or perhaps is actually interred within this tomb. On the outside of the Great Church, other burials or tombs were discovered during excavations of the eastern pathway that defines the cloister and towards the eastern exterior of the vestry, or the vestry is the one on the right. The cloister example comprised a disturbed stone coffin, which was not fully excavated. Instead, only the top was uncovered and defined, so that therefore no human materials were found in the grave on the left. But this was obviously another high-status burial based on its relationship with the cloister, which is obviously a very important place within the Abbey, and because of the stone coffin that defined the body. The other tomb was on the right, was an interesting teardrop shape and was found more or less beneath the vestry wall. Again, little at the moment can be said of the tomb beyond its form and its stratigraphic position. Within the south transept of the Great Church, further inhumations were recorded. The skeleton in the photo on the right, again, very well preserved. Nearby investigations of the tomb or grave marker within the east chapel of the south transept, which is here, revealed that it was the grave marker wasn't placed on top of a inhumation. So again, this is kind of more 20th century additions or kind of the moving about of original features and kind of placing them in areas where you might expect to find them, or where they were kind of more visually prominent. So again, this demonstrates the extent to which architectural features and ornaments were shifted about during the 20th century. Returning to the inhumations on the southeast exterior of the Great Church, additional analysis from Cardiff University provided more information on these two individuals. So the photos on the two on the right. One was a gracile male of around 30 years old. The other was a reasonably well-built male of 16 years old. The heavy muscle attachments on the younger guy indicated he obviously led a physically active life, probably filled with things like manual labor. The gracile male, which is situated on the left in this photo, two photos on the right, was likely a monk, so somebody who didn't lead a particularly physical life. The 16-year-old was potentially of the lay classes. Initially, the laity weren't allowed to be interred within the Abbey grounds, but from 1217 onwards, the General Chapter authorised the opening of the Cistercian cemeteries to the lay classes. This occurred during the time of Tintern 1, which is the period during which these two individuals were interred. Finally, it's worth pointing out that it seems possible that the two burials were interred separately at different times, as they were divided vertically, as you can see here in this middle photo, divided vertically by a thin layer of soil. This is kind of difficult to interpret. So the final burials that I'll mention here are the ones that belong to the post-Reformation period. As is indicated on the screen, these skeletons were shown on BBC's Digging for Britain programme. The skeletons included one towards the southern exterior of the south transept, and another two buried together towards the eastern exterior of the presbytery and rear chapel of the great church. Again, the skeletons were analysed by Cardiff University, or more specifically Richard Madrick, using the photo at the top right, and Kira Butler, who was at that point a PhD student. The single skeleton was an adult with, that's the one bottom right, with significant physical deformities, included outwardly projecting upper incisors, which is quite difficult to imagine, but very, very visually prominent. The double burial, so this one here, comprised a pair of young children, probably toddlers, or at least not far off toddler age. During the Digging for Britain episode, it was suggested that these individuals, as in like all three, could have been persecuted Catholics whose families wanted them to be buried close to the Abbey, which is obviously a Catholic place of pilgrimage. Whether or not this is precisely true, there's no doubt that the people who buried these bodies were effectively trespassing. Moving on from the later Great Church burials, I'm going to basically close this talk by mentioning the post-medieval and modern activity that went on in the interior of the Great Church. So one of the first things we noticed when stripping the topsoil from the interior was the amount and extent of the ceramic drainage pipes. These spread out, as you can see, all across the excavation area, but survived particularly well within the north transept. That's the photo on the right. These pipes, it seems, were laid during the conservation and refurbishment works of the 19th and early 20th centuries for the purposes of alleviating floodwater. Situated within the north transept was a tiled floor. That's these two photos on the left. This floor was made of genuine medieval tiles, but was assembled in the 19th century. The floor was rather elaborate, and when we uncovered it, we were all very excited. But unfortunately, it's fake, basically. And this on this slide is evidence of more. We've called it fakery. This kind of reconstructing and repositioning things in kind of out of context. So this fakery includes many of the chapel altars, pretty much all of which were assembled during the 20th century, although at least one dated to around the 18th century. The chapel altar at the rear of the church was interesting, as in its original 13th century Gothic form, the church very likely wouldn't have had a single rear. That's a single altar at the rear. So I think I believe the central rear part would have been divided into two chapels and kind of respective altars. To the exterior of the great church, we found much evidence of landscaping dating mainly to the 1750s. So this is a contemporary with the picturesque movement. Like I've already mentioned, such works form part of an attempt to transform the Abbey into a romantic ruin. And dotted around the interior of the great church, we found several 18th and 19th century coins, including a George III penny dating to 1806, a George II 2-pence cartwheel dating to 1797, and an 1888 Victorian silver shilling. This serves as evidence of people, again, visiting and admiring Tintern Abbey after it was basically transformed from a Catholic place of pilgrimage to a romantic place of pilgrimage. And how are we doing for time? Yeah, I'll pass it back over to Will, yeah?
Just to wrap up, we quite cunningly designed this talk to bring it to the end of the excavations and provide the context for them. We'll leave the conservation process entirely out. It's another talk again. There's another 30 odd slides we could use, but we fantasise that we might be quicker than normal and talk a bit less, but that wasn't particularly realistic, was it really, Rhys? I think. Yeah, so if I rattle through the presentation very quickly, and take us back to where this ended. So ultimately, we were very happy with the information that we got from the excavations. It sort of vindicated the approach. I think can't stress enough how awful the upper surfaces of the archaeology were. Everything had just been dug up, thrown back in. We showed you the land drain slides where they'd actually just hacked out the archaeology of the North Transept. They put a sump in. That was one of the only bits of research sort of work that we actually did. But it's an opportunity to look through damaged deposits rather than dig up new for the sake of it. Everything else was purely to inform condition of foundations and the condition of the ground below. And you end up with a revised scheme for the scaffolding, which looks something like this. This is for the next phase. So we finished our first phase of conservation work, and this is at the East End, so it'll be up here next year. Tallest scaffold I think we've ever built after the Eagle Tower in Carnarvon, and almost certainly the heaviest. But you can see the method used to basically just get the scaffold in. The whole purpose of this excavation was to scaffold a big conservation project. Spreader, sleepers, extra bars to spread the weight around, and then adjusting the different uprights to avoid archaeological features. And then following that, Black Mountains have done all the surveying within a billionth of a millimetre of accuracy with their kit. So they were the people to mark out on protective surfaces. There's another sort of foot or so of compacted gravel laid on top of everything. Structural engineers instructions, and you can see the sleepers, you see boxed in upstanding monuments, and then marked out on the ground by Rhys. Did quite a lot of this, didn't you, back in the day? So the scaffolders themselves, when they're on site, watching brief as well, don't stand on it, don't push anything on the ground there, just to make sure the plan actually matched the reality. And you can see things like the boxing in of the bases of the columns. They're a couple of meters high, those plywood constructions. So it effectively did its job, and you end up with something like this. Very, very high, very, very functional scaffold. You can take lots of spaces. But I could play five-a-side football on a couple of bits of it. It's very big, but from our point of view, it's much easier than working on a plank with no safety, no chance of accidents, fingers crossed. So we won't go into the masonry conservation. It's a talk in itself. I find equally fascinating. What do you put back? How do you choose your materials? How do you choose the form of the stones, the technology versus the old-fashioned trigonometric masons methods? I'll just rifle through it, give some tantalising looks at what we've been up to. There we are, big grassy wall head, or transepts again, that needs an explanation in itself. Every method that's been employed, pinning, pointing, 1,000 little pins holding some windows together. The state that some of the masonry got into, you could push your fingers through these and water moving down from above. Last resort interventions, and then these places where we've actually decided to go the whole hog and replace stones. And then the technology behind that, the conversations, nearly a fight, that one actually, it just calmed down afterwards. What works, what doesn't, and lots of opinions, lots of sources of information to feed into that process. And then the whole building archaeology, laser scanning, examining other bits of the church, making hand templates, buying mid-19th century antiquarian books that were virtually impossible to get hold of anywhere else. CAD drawings, massive CNC stone carving machines that actually cut in. It's almost like a massive laser scanner, really, but it deals with stone, all hand dressed afterwards. And then you get these wonderful, wonderful, very carefully selected stone by stone decisions on replacing. The hardest thing I've had to do my entire job, 15 years at Cadw now, making a decision to take out something that's been there for, well, since the 1270s, 1280s, simply because it no longer serves a structural purpose. And this is every day, every single stone is a separate decision. And everything from lead drip moulding, how do you control water running off the structure? Well, putting new ones in looks a bit brutal, so we just put a little lead sleeve on instead. Spent maybe 3 hours hosing the wall down to see where the water went after this was installed as well as before it. What are the impacts? Every single thing you do there has some sort of consequence or knock-on effects. You have to be very, very careful that every decision, don't think anything lightly, really. And as the scaffold comes down, we get this beautiful effect of the sort of seamlessly, not seamlessly, because obviously much, much sharper, but the new masonry sort of blended into the background with the old. And that's now going to be visible for the next X amount of time until we put the next scaffold up in 30, 40 years. So in terms of the longer term project, we've currently just finished. We signed off the masonry works this end of the church, and we'll be moving here. The scaffolds in the process of coming down. So that design that you saw will be going up and over this. And then more of the same again. The projects within projects, the oxhide burial that we saw a little bit earlier, that's being dealt as an entirely separate stream of work in itself. We need a lot of specialists who've dealt with these things in the past to help us there. And all those processes, the building archaeology, the historical research, it all carries on in the background. And that's got to be the big challenge next time. We're right up against that. Only place I've ever got vertigo on a Cadw site was looking at that with the clouds moving behind me. It's like 15 lifts up, really, really, really high. And to finish, you never really finish this kind of work. So when we're done, same with the Forth Bridge, conservation has got their own principles. It is the careful management of change. It's the management of the process of decay. So when one of our senior managers asked us, well, what's the shelf life on this work? What's its sell-by date? Well, there isn't one, is there? Because we know we'll be working possibly on the same stretch of the wall, maybe while the different phases of work are going on. When you snag a phase off on a building like this and check for defects that haven't been picked up by the work, there's always something else. Therein lies madness to ever really finish it. These buildings shift, they move, and they're constantly decaying. So however Tintern's presented in the future, romantic ruin it won't be. Sterile guardianships, like possibly not. We'll be looking at some sort of new surface in there, but we'll have to look at how we control visitor movement through these monuments. You cannot ever guarantee, due to the age of the stone and the sort of inbuilt inherent defects in the sort of the geology and the masonry, that you can't guarantee these bits aren't going to keep falling down, which is a slightly bleak outlook, but that's time decay, too constant really. But out of it, we'll come with probably the best recorded, best understood of all of our guardianship monuments. Massive contribution made by Rhys and his team as well in giving us a construction sequence from the first church right the way through to the dissolution and the sort of embellishment and creation of a monument from the Dukes of Beaufort to the Ministry of Works. And finish off on some of the cast of characters that have been involved. We will be speaking a lot more widely on this over the next couple of years. Keep an eye out. Probably got another day school planned in Tintern. End of this coming year, the year we're in now, isn't it? It'll be next year then in that case. It's already October, isn't it? But there are various talks. You can see a longer hand version of the whole talk on the Abbey Come Here friend's website as well. So the information is accessible. Eventually we'll be drip feeding out the interim report for the first phase of archaeology is due soon. And then various other pieces of reportage where the specialist things like stained glass and stuff will be getting dripped out as and when we feel that the time is right. So again, thank you all for having us, and hopefully we're not too late overrunning as well.